A little under 46 minutes. That's the amount of time it takes Adventure Time to go from Finn losing his arm in Escape from the Citadel to him getting it back at the end of Breezy. And more so than anything else about the storyline, I think this is what has created such a negative consensus among fans regarding Finn's arc at the beginning of the show's 6th season. After years of so many hints about Finn losing his arm, the show finally made good on its promise in one of the best scenes of the entire series, and then backtracked on it 4 episodes later in an episode that was always going to be controversial regardless of its ending. But now, nearly 10 years and over 100 quarter hours later, is this string of episodes actually as damaging to the franchise as many declared a decade ago, or has all of this time and all of this context allowed us to see Finn's first stint as an amputee in a different light? In this video, we're going to look back at everything in between this moment and this moment as I attempt to defend what many deem to be Adventure Time's biggest misstep. Before we get to Finn getting his arm back, we gotta talk about him losing it in the first place. And before we get to that, we gotta talk about Martin. Throughout the first 5 seasons of the show, the identity of Finn's parents was something that was not only not revealed, but was also not really even mentioned. Sure, there are a few moments in the series where Finn has a moment of contemplation about his status as the only human in Ooo, especially when Susan shows up, but in general, Finn's lack of understanding of his own origins is something that the show somewhat ignores, as his story starting as an abandoned baby on a leaf and ending up with him being this great world-saving hero is somewhat of his trademark, especially in comparison to the typical chosen one type of story that other cartoons of the time often end up falling into. At the end of the show's 5th season though, this changes, as Billy gives us, and Finn, confirmation that his father is still alive, a lead that is explored in the 2-parter that opens the following season. And while most of the first bit of Wake Up / Escape from the Citadel isn't super relevant to this video, I think it's worth mentioning that, in the process of Jake trying to help Finn reconnect with his father, the pair end up releasing the Lich, which ultimately results in both Prismo's demise, as well as the release of a bunch of other criminals. This endeavor for Finn to finally meet the guy he spent his entire life thinking about has now caused more damage than he could ever imagine. So obviously, when he does meet Martin and the man that Martin is, Finn is more than upset. While the idea of Martin not being the superhero that Finn imagined wasn't exactly revolutionary for the show, I really love how they characterize him here. Martin isn't some kind of supervillain who hates Finn and wants to destroy the world, he's just utterly indifferent. And while later episodes will slowly start to portray Martin as, at least at one point, being a somewhat caring father, as far as this episode goes, Finn learns that all of the horrible things that he's caused has had the end result of freeing his criminal father who wants nothing to do with him, and equally so, doesn't even care enough to tell Finn why he left in the first place. And it's him fighting this idea that ultimately leads Finn towards the impetus of this video, as he refuses to let his father leave for a second time without any kind of explanation, as the grass sword transforms to allow him to hold on to his father for at least a little bit longer. And this is where, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, that we get one of the most beautiful scenes that the show has ever put out. And that statement isn't just true because of the stunning visuals, but also because, more so than any other place in the series, we see Finn's optimism towards the world being completely crushed, as his grass arm fails him and he falls into the sea of the Citadel without it. And throughout the next 2 minutes that follows, Adventure Time demonstrates multiple opportunities to make the situation better, but at every stop, the series allows Finn to live through all of the pain that this moment causes. For example, when a little bit of healing Guardian blood, something proven to be able to fix severe injuries mere moments ago, falls onto what's what's left of his arm, it leaves him with only a flower instead of the new limb that you would expect. Despite everything that's going on in this moment, including the fact that Finn likely still believes that Jake is fighting the Lich, he just continues to grimace as he allows himself to sink further into the sea. As, for the first time in the show, Finn just doesn't have any fight left. And while this episode does have somewhat of a happy ending on the Lich side, Finn ends this one at the lowest place that we had ever seen the character, as he's left with his worldview destroyed, his arm gone, and no further information about his past, outside of the fact that his father doesn't care about him. And then the next episode is a goofy quarter hour about Banana Guard incompetence. And it's not that either of James 2 or Sad Face are necessarily bad episodes, although Sad Face is, but it's a bit weird to go from Finn feeling completely empty to him just partaking in candy shenanigans and then back to him feeling completely empty. I think there was a way to make this work too, as there are plenty of episodes in season 6 that either don't or barely feature Finn that they could have put in between Escape from the Citadel and the Tower to better demonstrate a period of time passing without having to show Finn in a mental state that doesn't really make any sense. Although, these episodes do demonstrate one thing, which is that the show was fully capable and somewhat willing to do regular adventure-timey episodes with a one-armed Finn. Either way though, enough complaining about scheduling, let's go ahead and get into the next chapter of Finn's arm journey, as in between these two not-so-great episodes, we get a much deeper look into the consequences of the season premiere.
Babies building a tower into space.
While the next and final episode I'm going to talk about in this video is likely going to leave its comment section in pieces, you'd be hard-pressed to find a fan of Adventure Time who didn't at least like the tower. And while its ending with Finn, not suddenly growing back his arm is likely what has led to this reception, there's a bunch of other stuff about this episode that just makes it really difficult to hate. Speaking of which, to just generally talk about what Finn goes throughout this arc, our main protagonist will find himself going through the 5 stages of grief, the first 3 of which taking place throughout the tower. At the beginning of the episode, as Finn finds himself trying to use a candy arm to continue life as if nothing happened, it's pretty clear that he's in stage 1, denial, as he refuses to admit to himself that his long-lost father was responsible for taking his favorite arm. And after this plan doesn't go well, Finn finds himself moving to the next stage, anger, as he tells Jake about his desire to track down Martin and return the favor. Before Finn gets into the next stage that he'll spend the remainder of the episode in, let's quickly talk about what everybody else is doing in this episode, as Jake, Bonnie, and eventually Carol all try to get Finn to deal with his grief in the way that they want him to. Jake tells him to just follow his heart and do what feels right. PB wants him to be careful and eventually something else that we'll obviously talk about later, and Carol tells him to just get away from all of his problems and fester about them. Unfortunately for the 3 of them though, Finn doesn't spend much time listening to their suggestions, as he's busy going through stage 3, bargaining, as he decides that the only way he is going to be happy is by building a tower to space and ripping off the arm of his father, something made possible by his new emotion-fueled arm. And does the show's explanation for Finn quote-unquote manifesting a telekinetic electro-emotional prosthesis really make any sense? Of course not. But man, does it create such a great premise that the show's visual and sound design completely benefits from. Seriously, this episode has some of the best music to come out of the show. From the incredibly moody instrumentals towards the beginning of Finn's project, to the super catchy babies building a tower into space, everything in this episode sounds good. Something that backs up the visuals, which, especially as a result of the show going all out in creating a tower with different materials and then showing that process with some great shots, creates an unbelievably terrific horrific representation of everything that Finn is going through. Speaking of which, as I mentioned before, Finn spends the bulk of this episode going through that third stage of grief, as he decides that the only way to get rid of this feeling inside of him is by inflicting the same pain that he's going through back onto his father, something that completely takes over his mind. Finn finds himself so unable to process anything other than what he believes will allow him to get back to normal that he ends up pursuing a goal that a stable version of the character would obviously see as hopeless, as he eventually and predictably fails, which allows PB to step in. The way that the show approaches the final few minutes of this episode is one of my favorite ways to illustrate just how much the series had matured by this point in its run. On the surface, what occurs at the end of this one should be a happy ending, as PB gives Finn an opportunity to take his rage out on a fake Martin, only to realize when the fake Martin repeats Finn's sentiment about losing his favorite arm, that inflicting that same pain back onto others isn't what he actually needs. But despite this entire sequence just feels so wrong. Everything about it, from the way that PB infantilizes Finn to his completely blank expression afterwards, just gives off the impression that, while this has alleviated the revenge-fueled emotion that gave him his new arm, the empty husk that is left behind isn't exactly better. And in the final moments of this episode, while the tower falling down and crushing the Candy Kingdom is admittedly this hilarious gag to cap off this fairly melancholy episode, it also goes to further show that everything that Finn did today has had actual consequences, as he ends up inflicting his pain onto somebody else. The Tower is this really interesting episode for a bunch of reasons, but none more so than the fact that, even with the 4 perspectives in this episode that all seem to counter each other, the Tower doesn't pick one that's supposed to be correct, but instead decides to portray each one of them as flawed. Jake's plan for Finn to follow his heart ends with Ooh being ripped apart and the Candy Kingdom being crushed. Finn's plan for revenge never had a chance to work out. Carol's plan of just trying to run away leaves her constantly looking back on her past life and never actually moving on, and PB's plan is what creates the Finn that Breezy will explore. While this episode does explore various themes, such as the consequences of revenge, I think at its core, the Tower is about how sometimes, when trying to get through a traumatic experience, every option kind of sucks. There was nothing that Finn could do after losing his arm and his father in the same moment that would come with anything but a boatload of misery. Finn's only real choice is to just try and get through the inevitable grief, as after PB's forced intervention causes him to leave the bargaining phase, he sinks into stage 4, depression, something that he spends the majority of the next episode enduring.
I'm lost in the darkness, what will this bring?
Alright, before getting into this episode, I just want to say that if you are somebody who dislikes Breezy, which most people are, I completely understand and respect that. This episode is straight out of the mind of Jesse Moynihan, and thus is consequently immensely weird and immensely polarizing. Obviously, as the title of this video isn't a lie, the remainder of the script that I am currently reading is almost entirely a defense of Adventure Time's most controversial quarter hour. But this is in no way supposed to be dismissing people who see this episode as something other than fantastic. Also, one more slight warning. Usually when I talk about shows that aired on a kids network, I try to keep that same kind of rating for these videos, but there really isn't a way to seriously analyze this episode without getting into some deeper topics. So while I'm obviously not going to get like super graphic or anything, the rest of this video is going to touch on things such as depression and sexual assault. So if for any reason you don't want to hear about either of of these things, this is your last chance to click off. Anyway, enough trying to not upset people, let's go ahead and get into Breezy. As I mentioned before, Finn enters this episode in a state that's hard to describe as anything other than depression, as he visits Dr. Princess for his now drooping flower arm, responding to her question about how he's feeling with this.
I don't know. Burp, 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 burp. I guess I don't feel anything. Blah.
Dr. Princess, who's notably not a doctor, then prescribes Finn with some pretty not great advice for a patient who's pretty clearly going through a depressive episode, as she tells Finn to just go and try and have fun until he feels better. The way that Finn decides to take this pretty vague advice is what he spends the majority of the remainder of this video doing, as he tries to set up a bunch of flings with random princesses until he feels something. Something shown this episode to just be a quick kiss, but is obviously representative of something else. Before he can begin that plan though, we get the first half of one of my favorite songs to ever come out of this franchise, Lost in the Darkness, which, while admittedly is not as catchy as the Rebecca Sugar songs you're likely thinking of, has some of my favorite lyrics to ever come out of this franchise. We'll get to Breezy's part in all of this later, but let's quickly go through Finn's words during the first half of the song, which only contains the 4 lines currently on screen. Using darkness as a metaphor for depression is not something that Adventure Time is the first to ever do, but I just love how Finn's chilling vocals paint a picture of him being unable to see or unable to feel anything, as the naive and innocent summer of his life is over and the autumn is descending quickly. To get back to the title character, Breezy spends this quarter hour lusting over Finn's flower, the physical representation of his vulnerability after everything that happened with his father, as she helps Finn go from princess to princess, getting a quick smooch before moving on. And that is what essentially makes up the structure of the first half of this episode, as Finn hangs out with a princess, friendzones Breezy, and then finds the next one, never making any kind of real connection, and as this episode will later highlight, never feeling any kind of real love. Besides the main pair of criticisms of this episode that I'll talk about in a few minutes, something that is often brought against Breezy is that it doesn't make sense for Finn to be hanging out with people that he barely knows to try and feel better instead of his friends. And while I think a little bit of this can be explained by the events of the tower, where PB especially doesn't handle his situation very gracefully, I think this interaction with Jake in the middle of the episode continues to illustrate this point. When Jake sees Finn trying to talk to Frozen Yogurt Princess, he notices the similarity between her and Finn's 2 former flames and drops this line.
Guess you're still hung up on both of them, bro.
I ain't hung up on nobody.
And yeah, while this is not an out-of-character moment for Jake, who's cluelessly done callous things like this multiple times in the show, Finn's reaction to it feels more than justified. Obviously, Finn is going through a bunch of stuff, as he slowly realizes that he's not getting the feeling of love that he desires from these quick hookups. So obviously, he doesn't like being reminded of all of the times in his life where he did feel genuine love, only for it to not work out long term. All Finn wants is to recreate the feelings that he once had for Flame Princess and Bonnie, but now, even as he coasts to quote-unquote makeouts with pretty much any princess that he wants, he still feels empty. And it's this emptiness that causes him to begin considering just letting his flower die after this interaction, only for Breezy to step in, telling Finn about how she's a virgin queen bee, whose carefree days of being able to chase who she wants will be over as soon as she drinks from the royal jelly. And in an episode with plenty of unsettled metaphors, this one might take the cake, as she continues to try and take Finn's flower for herself before she's unable to continue freely chasing the things that she loves. Obviously, this bums Finn out, as he decides to have some carefree fun with Breezy to get his mind off of things, at least until they're interrupted by some other bees, authorities, who declare him and Breezy as unnatural, eventually charging Finn as a result. In an attempt to defend Finn from the hatred that they are receiving because of their relationship, Breezy ultimately decides to take from the royal jelly early, which, while it does get the other bees to leave, as well as transform her into a more humanoid creature, it also takes away her societal freedom to be truly free. And while Breezy is initially okay with this outcome, Finn immediately knows that she'll regret it, as he knows that he's not willing to make the sacrifice that she is going to want. At this moment, Breezy declares that not only does she love Finn's flower, the physical representation of her physical attraction for him, but that she thinks that she might also love him too, wanting him to become her permanent drone. When he declines this offer though, she quickly becomes dejected, as Finn repeats the same sentiment that we know he's been going through throughout this entire time. Finn feels nothing. Nothing about Breezy, nothing about his arm, just nothing at all. Finn is lost in the darkness, and it's only getting darker. Alright, no more dancing around it with fancy sentences, let's go ahead and talk about the most controversial part of the episode. After Breezy leaves, Finn decides to continue going from princess to princess, trying to make himself feel better, as we see him in the forest dancing with LSP. She's not entertained by this dance though, as she demands to kiss, claiming that she's well aware of his quote, dirty deeds. And when Finn gives her the same quick kiss that he's been giving all episode, she demands more, wanting to take their makeout session to the deep end, all while Finn seems less than enthusiastic about the endeavor. Unfortunately though, this doesn't seem to dismay LSP, as she closes in as the screen cuts to black. And when we see Finn again, he's trying to cover up as his flower begins to wilt. So yeah, this whole moment begs the question that people have been asking about this episode for nearly a decade. Did Lumpy Space Princess sexually assault Finn? And while I do understand how one could get that out of the scene, that's not really what I think they were trying to portray. After Finn believes that he basically just ruined Breezy's life, his desire to try and feel anything at all is at an all-time high, which is why, even if it's not something that Finn would usually do, he allows himself to be taken advantage of by LSP. And does this make her a bad person? Almost certainly. Something that hopefully shouldn't be a revelation, but I don't think that this moment is really meant to highlight her doing this horrible thing to Finn. The point is that Finn lets it happen. He's so desperate for any semblance of emotion that he's willing to give it a try, but all he finds afterwards is a new low, as his flower continues to wilt. Luckily for Finn, his darkest moment comes right before the sun rises, as Breezy makes her last appearance in the main series and begins to sing a continuation of Lost in the Darkness. And just like the first half, the final few moments of this episode contains some of my favorite songwriting from the show, all set against this stunning visual sequence. As Breezy begins to sing, her lyrics talk about the love that she has for Finn's flower, describing it as singing without words and ultimately beyond reason. Deep down, Breezy knows that Finn and his flower will never reciprocate that feeling, but also that it really doesn't matter. She celebrates the love that she had and the love that she felt so much that she feels like she can burst. While this is occurring, Finn obviously wakes up, as he begins to remember the love that he also used to feel, at least before he stopped feeling anything at all. And what better way to visualize this than by showing his first love of all, Princess Bubblegum, as Breezy and her voice fade into PB, who's holding the first ever appearance of the Finn sword. By the way, have I mentioned yet how beautiful this entire sequence is? Seriously though, PB in this moment is representative of not just Finn's romantic desires, but also the love that he has ever felt for anybody, including the idea of his father before what took his arm. Ever since that event, the only thing that Finn has felt is anger, and ever since PB let him simulate revenge and get all of that anger out, he's felt nothing at all. Finn has been completely lost in the darkness, and now, as PB sings, he's using love as his guide to get out of it. As soon as all of this clicks for Finn, his flower begins to sprout into a tree, leaving a fleshy arm behind. And while I think that you can theorize just about any reason for why this happens, I like to think that it was Finn's mental rejection of love that was blocking the healing guardian blood in the first place, and that this moment of realization and remembrance for his feelings in the past is what allows it to react with what was left of the grass sword to create what we see on screen. Either way, the episode ends with two different characters feeling pure joy. Finn getting his arm back, and Breezy finally getting the flower that she's been chasing this whole time, giving it a kiss as we cut to credits.
Speaking of arms, though,
Oh, yeah. I got it from my PB Dream Sword.
After spending like 10 minutes defending the episode where Finn gets his arm back, let's finally answer the question, was it a good idea? And the answer is probably not. Just like everybody else, I think it likely would have been best if they had just kept this loss permanent, as a representation of just how much he has changed since the beginning of the show. But assuming that they were going to bring his arm back anyway, likely due to executive meddling, do I think that Breezy was a good way to do it? Absolutely. As the show progresses, it becomes more and more obvious what drives Finn to do the things that he does. Just like his mother, Finn's a helper, and that drive to help comes from the love that he has for those around him and the good that he sees in everybody, a worldview that Martin swiftly destroys. And it's this betrayal by the man who should love him more than anybody that sends Finn on this spiral, as he goes through the 5 stages of grief for both his arm and his past self, only finally reaching acceptance when Breezy is able to remind him of the love that he once felt and the love that he needs to feel again. While the help that PB and Jake give Finn ultimately falls short, in both cases it came from a place of love. While Finn's father might not care about him, plenty of people do, and that's what he has to focus on to get through his trauma, not by trying to create love by hooking up with every princess that he can find. In general, Finn losing his arm was an arc that was always somewhat set up for failure, as Adventure Time has spent 5 seasons setting this up, only for corporate to likely demand that it not be permanent. But given what they had, the crew, just like always, produced a story unlike anything else in animation, capping it off with Breezy, an episode I had to watch a dozen times a decade later to try and figure out all of its meaning. To answer the question that this section is posing, given the fact that Finn gets his arm back anyway, did any of this even matter? And I hope by now you can guess my answer, because even if there isn't a permanent change in his body, Finn is just not the same character after this point. While he does regain the ability to love and feel loved back from his father, Finn never quite loses the slight sense of cynicism gained from this interaction. As seen when his father returns a dozen or so episodes later, as Finn is suspicious the entire time and protects himself by refusing to become attached. The carefree kid from the first 5 seasons of the show just doesn't exist anymore, as that part of Finn is still at the Citadel. This arc from the beginning of the show's 6th season is just like the rest of the season, as it's Adventure Time at its weirdest, its most experimental, its best, and ultimately its worst. But to me, there is something in this batch of episodes, and the way that it portrays Finn learning to love again, that I'll always appreciate while watching, and seemingly more so every time. Anyway, that's about it for me. Thank you so much to everybody who watched this longer than usual video, as I was originally just going to do a 10-minute analysis on just Breezy, but decided that it deserved this double-length outing instead. I do want to quickly apologize for the fact that, unlike what I said in January, this is not a video on islands. When I went to start that video, I realized that I needed to talk about Preboot and Reboot before then, and before I talked about Finn losing his arm for a second time, I obviously had to talk about Breezy. I do promise that I will do islands soon, as well as Preboot and Reboot, but since I kind of skipped past Finn Sword in this episode, I might need to revisit a different Moynihan classic before then. If you want to tell me how Breezy is actually bad and LSP belongs on a list, you can find my Twitter somewhere in the description. But either way, this has been AmpleSamuel, and I'll see you in about a week with a shorter, less insightful, and just generally worse video. Thanks for watching.